Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Wine Woman of Words. And joining us in a minute will be Michelle, but our special guest for this evening is Rosie Danan, and she is here to talk to us about her book, Do Your Worst. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It looks like Michelle is back, hopefully. So happy to be here with you both.
That's
Did I
okay.
freeze like right when I started talking?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm just turning off my video just in hopes that that works.
Yeah, that's
Um,
usually what helps.
yes. So I'll just be the glowing black box for the evening.
Aw.
The black screen. Womp womp.
So let's go ahead and officially, properly get this show started. So, for those who are not familiar with Do Your Worst, could you give us a little bit of a synopsis?
Sure, yeah. The sort of one sentence elevator pitch is it's about an aspiring curse breaker and a disgraced archaeologist who unknowingly accept conflicting assignments at the same infamous Scottish castle.
Ooh, I love it. And I was actually just watching a Christmas movie. And don't come at me, people, because even though it's November, I will still watch Christmas movies. Halloween is over. Don't hate me. But I was watching a Christmas movie last night at a set in a Scottish castle, and she was an archaeologist, and it was very entertaining. And so I love this concept, and there's so much within. Here's a history nerd coming out. There's so much history in Scotland that we kind of seem to take for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually was living in London while I was writing this book. And so I was able to go to Scotland for a research trip, which was amazing. And getting to actually talk to like several local guides about the lore specifically associated with like fae and fairies. And it was really awesome to just hear from people who had grown up hearing those stories passed down through their family lines, and kind of going to some of the sites that really do sort of like feel mystical. It was a really awesome trip, and I think it added to my enthusiasm for writing the setting and hoping to kind of bring that feeling to life.
That's one of the things here in the US that is kind of a bit of a downer because we totally dismiss the lore of the Fae and all of that. But in Europe, they were so prevalent throughout so many of the cultures. Italian culture, they actually had fairies and some very randy, I should say, elves. And so you have a lot of that in the book, I understand as well.
Um, like horniness.
Not necessarily, but I mean the lore of the Fae and all of that.
Yes, yeah, definitely Fae lore. And I think like one of the reasons I wanted to play with magic systems is because it sort of gives you permission to do anything. It, like breaks the rules of the world as we know it. And so both my protagonists do sort of use it as an excuse to like act on the belligerent sexual tension that is building between them as they kind of get in each other's way.
So that
Michelle?
is a oh, sorry. That is a perfect segue to jump to a question a little further down the list, but that's okay. Um, One of the blurbs for Do Your Worst mentions your, I'm doing the air quotes because you can't see me, expert sexual attention between our two main characters. And we have talked about writing a good sex scene on Wine, Women, and Words, but I don't think we've ever actually discussed how writers approach building that sexual tension between characters. And I would imagine it's kind of a balancing act because you can't rush into it, you can't draw it out too long. How do you handle kind of building that tension between characters?
Yeah, I honestly think that's one of my favorite parts of writing romance is the tension. One of my friends that I work with talked about it as like you're almost like building up energy that then gets sort of like released in your sex scenes. But you only get to build up that energy to a point, right? And so you have to kind of work at it as much as you can. And I think there's a couple different techniques that I use. One is that I like always write opposites attract. I think that brings like a really nice inherent tension when your characters like think differently and they come from different worlds and they approach problems differently, and there's just conflict internally and externally when somebody is so different from you, but you also find yourself drawn to them. This in Do Your Worst, it's specifically, enemies to lovers, annoyance to lovers, whatever you kind of want to call that. And I think that has its own sexual tension where like, how anger and like lust have like really similar physical responses. Like you get warm and your heart races. And I think that it's that whole line of like, there's a thin line between love and hate. And so I think there's a lot of fun room to play in that, where as soon as someone tells you, you shouldn't do something, you want to do it all the more. So I think that, little bit of playful wrongness makes, them being attracted to one another, like more fun to write. And I also tend to write forced proximity. So in this one, they're kind of both forced to work at the Scottish castle that's crumbling and has all kinds of zany mysteries and kind of like bad stuff that happen. So that sort of like almost pens them in and allows, like I said, they can't really get away from each other and how they feel about each other. So those are, I think, some of the elements. And then I also like to think about like what kind of physical touch I can incorporate that's not like inherently sexual. So in this one, there's sort of like hair braiding as foreplay, which again, I think like there's something very intimate about having someone's hands on you in that way. And, there's a lot of like nerve endings in the scalp and stuff. So trying to like think about situations like that where it seems innocent, but then it's not because of how the characters feel about each other.
I don't have we never have talked about building sexual tension in writing, have we? I don't think we have.
No, not the sexual tension. We've talked about like the sex stuff. Like we had Kate Quinn talk about how to write a good sex scene.
It's like a dance.
Yeah, and a lot of it is building up those emotions. So I like the idea of building up those tensions, and that what you were talking about, Rosie, how you were able to just create those little things, those little touches, and like the hair braiding. That is very intimate. Hair is a very important thing. Touching somebody's hair without permission is very much a violation, and going in there, having somebody playing with her. I mean, every girl who has ever gone to the hairdresser and had a nice scalp massage while they're getting their hair done knows how wonderful it can feel.
Yeah, for sure.
So now, in another life long ago, I very briefly wanted to be an archaeologist because I don't know why, actually. I don't know the reason behind it, but it took a minute for it to click that archaeology requires one to get dirty. And I do not, in fact, like dirt and getting dirty. So I had to, change career paths there and college courses. But I love when books and movies give you the opportunity to get into that world. And what kind of research were you able to do, or did you do, to be able to get into Clark's world and his profession and bring that to life for him?
Yeah. So, I don't know if this was part of your inspiration when you were younger, but like I loved The Mummy 1999, which was like probably
Yes.
why. And I also, I love museums and stuff. And I, again, like was fortunate to like live in an area that was very rich. Like I actually went to Oxford, where Clark like fictionally got his PhD, and was able to like go to archaeological museums there and look at like research and artifacts, and kind of learn a little bit about how that program is structured for like the actual PhD and how the research is conducted. And then I also, like, one of my tricks for research is to look at Reddit AMAs, because you can find Reddit AMAs for like pretty much any profession. Like when I was writing my first book, The Roommate, and there's an adult performer, I like read, AMAs with adult performers, and that was really useful to get insider perspective. So definitely looked at some of those for archaeologists. There's also like a lot of sort of trade groups where archaeologists have forums where they're discussing kind of their preferences, whether it's like equipment or how they approach a site or how they select their research topic. Like you really can find a lot of online resources nowadays. So used kind of a hodgepodge of that. And then I also had a couple people who are in like my extended friends and family network that are either in the field or like adjacent to the field that I was able to get sort of one-on-one interviews with.
And for those who aren't familiar, the Reddit AMAs are Reddit Ask Me Anythings.
Yes, yeah. Like I said, they're fascinating, and like all kinds of people from celebrities to tradespeople, basically anything that you've ever been like, I would love to ask questions of like this type of person. Chances are that they're going to be on there. So it's really helpful if you're looking to kind of get that behind the scenes look at something and quickly, because they like the Q&A format is pretty concise.
That's fascinating. I never stopped to think that the Ask Me Anythings on Reddit would be such a good way, and that's my mind is just slightly blown here over that. I'm like, oh, now I want to go on there and do some research on the Reddit AMAs.
Yeah, that's one of my good research tips.
I love that.
Yeah, I don't think I had ever thought of that. That's a really good idea to get into. I mean, short of being able to interview someone, that's essentially interviewing someone but letting other people do the work for you. And you can just read all the answers.
Yeah, pretty much. And again, like depending on what you're looking into, sometimes there'll be like historic ones. You can say like, oh, this is what it was like to be an archaeologist 10 years ago. And then you'll have someone talking about like how the field is changing, even with global warming or something. So it's, yeah, I mean, now I'm going to have to find some new resources because all the authors are going to be using.
We're all here to help each other out.
Yeah.
Now, since we're on that train of thought, we always like to ask, what was the weirdest thing that you researched for this book? What's the weirdest thing that you found? Like we can limit it within the scope of your internet searching to the point where you're like, hopefully somebody won't come across this, or I can totally explain why I was researching this weird random thing.
I feel like there's a lot of different stuff, none of which is like overwhelmingly incriminating, but I feel like when you add them all up is incriminating. Like I definitely looked up like ancient manacles, like how are they constructed? Like how could you break them? Like that. I definitely looked up a lot of stuff about curses, obviously, like trying to understand like the lore in the particular area, and a lot of like history of the region in Scotland where the castle is located, and things like that. Not that that's like wildly weird. But yeah, I honestly like definitely coming off of, again, 2 books where it was about the adult entertainment industry, at least in part. This was like, I was like very comfortable researching everything here.
And it's going to be a really interesting changing of gears, going from writing about the adult entertainment industry to I'm going to write about, archaeologists and magic and stuff.
Yeah, I think in some ways it was like the biggest change was that I had to do world building, right? I had to create magic systems, and I had to not only like decide like this is how a curse would be formed, but then I also had to decide like this is how a curse would be broken, and like those are different. There is like degrees of complexity there, and also like kind of building out an entire methodology for curse breaking. Like, how would you start? How would you diagnose it? Like, what supplies would you use? So that was very different and more challenging than I thought. I think I was kind of naive because I grew up, I loved like 90s and early aughts, like Paranormal Properties. I loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I loved Charmed, all that stuff. And I think I thought that would make it come more naturally to me or something. It did not. But I think it was really like it felt like I was building a muscle that I hadn't used that much previously. And so I really, even though there were parts of it that were really hard, I really enjoyed building up that tool within my writing kind of toolkit, if you will. But I think like a lot of my core story elements are consistent. Like I mentioned, like there's still opposites attract, there's still forced proximity, it's still like a high heat, slow burn. So I, as a reader at least, and I always try to like write for myself as a reader because at least then one person likes the book. I feel like it's very natural for artists to maintain their like kind of core voice and the themes that they're interested in. Like whether you mean to or not, you just see them repeated again and again and again. And so in order to deliver variety and to keep people engaged, I do try to look for ways to push myself. And I also like, there's so many amazing romance novels that I only want to approach stories where I feel like I have something to say that's going to be different. So, yeah, I hope that readers who, enjoyed my first two novels will like find comfort and consistency in what I deliver as an author. But I think at the same time, like the setting, and even like the mystery elements, like hopefully will show something new.
I love what you were saying about the world building, and it just always blows my mind uh, how insightful writers can be when they're approaching a storyline, because it never, as just as a reader talking about your book, not looking at it from a writer standpoint, but as a reader, it never would have occurred to me to go, oh, well, now I have to, now you would have to figure out how to diagnose a curse and how would you do that? Those aspects of the world building wouldn't necessarily have occurred to me right off the cuff like that. So that I think that's really cool to be able to hear everything that goes into world building, even when you're not, you hear world building, you automatically think like high fantasy sometimes, but there's a lot of world building even in books that aren't necessarily high fantasy like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like romance, sometimes people are down on romance. And I feel like one of the critiques that gets leveled on romance is that it's like predictable and like I think people think it's easy to write. But like romance is often doing so many things at once. And like not only are you balancing two full character narratives, at least, unless you might be writing about a pairing that has more than two people in it, but like you've got two full characters that have to go on individual journeys as well as like a love story journey. So already you've got three threads. Then often you have like some kind of external conflict or something that you're dealing with. And then with this book, you had like a mystery element. And it was really important to me because again, this is how I read, and I'm like a little bit narrow in my focus. Like I like a mystery, but only in service of the romance. Like I don't want like tons and tons of page time away from like the core characters and how they're falling in love. So it was important to me for Do Your Worst for the mystery and the love story to be like really intertwined, and that like as they're falling in love, they're getting closer to figuring out what the curse is. And there's sort of like an inherent push and pull. Like sometimes they take a step back in the relationship and they take a step back in the curse breaking. So I think that's another thing, like, which maybe doesn't stand out as a, hopefully even doesn't stand out as a reader, because it should feel seamless. But from a craft perspective, that was very intentional.
Yeah, that's actually another question that we have on our list was, not only do you have the paranormal thread going through with Riley and and her curse breaking profession and everything that comes with that, but you also have to juggle, you know, the wit and comedy of the writing. You have to juggle the romance. You have to juggle. It's a balancing act of all of those different things. Do you have not necessarily a formula, but do you have a approach on how you weave all of that through, or does that kind of come through the editing process once that first draft is done?
Yeah, I think that like calibration of all the different threads of the story, if you will, is like a constant tweaking. I do try to plan out those, like I said, kind of core threads when I'm plotting the book originally. So I'll kind of think like, okay, Riley, for example, this is where she is at the start of the book, and this is where I want her to be at the end of the book in her individual journey. So this is like the emotional, physical, spiritual, whatever. This is the growth that I want her to have. And then likewise for Clark. And that growth can be like influenced by one another, but should be owned by them as separate characters. And then obviously like I have the romance beats. And I will use romancing the beat as like an outline, and I give myself permission to break that outline as I write, but I find that it's still a really useful core framework to build off of. And I think what I added in Do Your Worst, and this was like kind of a constant tweaking, was like the curse elements and how they would align to the romance beats. And I think I tried to get them to pair somewhat. Like I said, I was trying not to have too many curse beats that lived like outside of a romance beat.
You look like you have a question, Diana.
No, I was just contemplating,
but yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that and contemplating that the curse beat outside of the romance beat. And I think that kind of leads us to our super serious question, Michelle.
Yes, our very serious scientific survey.
Yes, because given how you were talking about the novel and all of that, we're going to have to talk something very, very serious here. I'm adjusting my glasses. We're getting, down to the heart of the matter. Michelle and I have noticed a couple of things. So I am a historical fiction author, and therefore I have to plot out my books. I love plotting out books. I'm very comfortable in that. However, when it comes to like my daily life, I like chaos. Chaos can ensue. There's chaos currently going around with my dogs in my office here. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that. Michelle, on the other hand, she writes fantasy, and she is as surprised as her characters are with what happens that day when she sits down to write. But in her personal life, she likes to have everything nice and neat and orderly. She loves to-do lists. To-do lists give me hives. So we're kind of in this interesting phase. So we started asking other authors. So Rosie, do you find yourself being a plotter? Do you like to plot out your books? Or are you like Michelle, where you just like to just show up and it's going to be a surprise for both you and your characters?
I'm definitely more of a plotter, although I will say like the ways in which I approach that are constantly evolving. Like I will start and I'll plot with Post-its like in a sort of early outline phase, and then I'll do a digital beat sheet in Excel. Then, as I'm writing, I will, like, one thing I started doing, I don't think for Do Your Worst, or actually maybe partially for Do Your Worst, but more in revisions, is I started like sort of outlining the scene by hand before I started drafting it. So not like writing the scene, but like here's kind of like what I'm trying to achieve. I don't know if either of you feel like this, but sometimes, probably not given what you've told me about your styles, but we'll see. I feel like I get like lost in the scene. Like I forget like what I was trying to make them do, or like where I was supposed to like balance layers of things. Cause you're always trying to balance like the action, the dialogue, the interiority, like there's like a lot happening. So, I don't know if it's just the way my brain works, but like having that, I can think better holistically when I'm writing with a pen. So I get myself sort of organized, I get all my thoughts out, and then I'm able to kind of like transfer it into writing on the computer a little more seamlessly. But yeah, do you ever have that feeling where you're like, I'm like lost in the sauce, like somewhere in the scene? like where was I going with this?
Yeah, exactly. There's a point where and there's also been points where I'm writing and I'm like, I don't like the scene. I'm like already like halfway through the scene. I'm like, this scene sucks. I need to write my way out of it and then go back and edit it out later. And that always happens. And I love that you brought up writing by hand holistically, because sorry, I have another dog on here who's jealous of one dog. So that writing holistically aspect is such a good exercise, I feel like, for writers, because I find it for me, if I'm stuck, if I'm feeling that whole writer's block, because I have issues with the term writer's block. But when I do feel stuck, just pulling out a pen and a piece of paper and a notebook and just starting to write and just seeing the scratch out, seeing that it helps get me back to writing.
Yeah. I think there's something about like switching formats. Like I feel like I rotate a lot now, where sometimes I'll draft on my phone because I feel like that's easier. I'm not like reading as I go. Sometimes I like will revise on my computer, or I'll, outline on my like in my notebook. Like every stage I have like a different preferred method and medium. But again, I'm hoping that translates to like more layers, like more richness, because I have been able to consider the scene in those different ways, because I do think your brain processes differently. Like
it does. Yeah, they've actually done some scientific studies on it. So your brain, when you're writing with your handwriting, the opposite side of your brain starts working, and then when you're versus when you're typing and using both hands, there's other parts of your brain that's activated. So it does exercise different aspects of those muscles.
There you go.
And I've found I don't often hand write, but I'll print out, a chapter or a section of whatever I'm working on, double spaced, and go through and edit it.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I don't know if it's everyone or a lot of people, or if it's just me, but I hate editing on a screen because sometimes my eyes just can't spot an error on a screen. For it's easier for me to see it on paper and catch it, or when I'm going through, like with my red pen, I'll figure out a better way to word something in the editing process. I know that's the whole point of the editing process, but I don't like doing it on a screen. I prefer to have the paper in front of me.
Oh, I'm the same way. How about you, Rosie?
Yeah, I again, like I try everything. I feel like you like to print it out, definitely like at the copy edit stage, when again it is getting more into those like nitpicky, word choice and punctuation and like making those kind of style edits. I don't know again how you guys feel. I'm not a very like careful reader. So how some people are really like eagle-eyed if there's like a misplaced comma or like a word that gets like swapped by one letter or something, they're just like whoosh, like here's all the typos. I'm not so I have to like call in the reserves for that, because I think I'm a reader a little bit, I think.
Yeah, it's always good to have this was something in the legal industry that we always had. It's always good to have a second pair of eyes
Yeah.
on a paper. And if you could have a second pair of eyes on the paper, try to get a third pair of eyes on the paper, because your brain will automatically fill in those spaces
Yeah.
where you think something is supposed to be. If you're missing an E on a word, you're going to fill it in. If you're missing something in that speech, you're going to fill it in. And for me, when I like to print out my books too, and I put them in a binder, and I like to read it like I'm reading a story. Like I'm reading the book already published, and then I take the red pen, and I never loved red ink so much until I became an author. That's like, I see the red ink and I'm like, ooh, yay. It's like I get to make all these changes and do all this work. It's going to be so much fun. And I say this just before I start some edits. So it's, it's a
We'll ask you again next week how you feel about it.
Yeah, ask me again later on.
And everyone, if you would like to order your own copy of Do Your Worst, be sure to check out the show notes. You'll find, of course, the link to our bookshop on bookshop.org for you to order your copy. As always, bookshop.org supports our incredible writers. It supports the podcast, but most importantly, it supports all of the wonderful indie bookstores out there. And Rosie, thank you so much for coming to hang out with us. I'm sorry, I had to turn off my camera and I'm just a talking box on the screen right now, but we had so much fun hanging out with you.
No, likewise. Yeah. Thank you for having me on and giving me the chance to chat about writing craft stuff. I always really like to hear how other people approach it. So you feel a little bit like less scatterbrained and wild, I think, when you're like, are you trying this? Because it always, yeah, like an art of invention a little bit.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your evening.
Yeah, you too. Bye. Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.